Hey, good morning.
Good
Thanks for
morning.
joining us again. I'm Chad.
And I'm Leslie, and we're live today. It's not pre-recorded, so make
Yeah,
sure it's working as I.
it's kind of convenient to have it pre-recorded a couple of times when we can't be here live, but it's much more fun to be live. The pressure's on. If you say something crazy, then it's just that's how it is.
You have to correct each other on air.
So if you're new to the broadcast here, we're actually going through the book of Matthew, describing how Jesus is greater than all the heroes of the Older Testament, and we're positing that the writer of Matthew, the evangelist Matthew, was actually trying to convey who Jesus is, not only with the stories that he chose, but also with the structure that he used. And so we've looked at different they're called pericopes, different stories in the Gospel of Matthew. And today we're going to be looking at a whole series of them from chapters 8 and 9.
And so, as you remember, when we did the first section where we were talking about Jesus is greater than Moses, we talked about that there was a narrative section, which means a story section, and then there was a teaching section. And this all took place between Matthew 1 through 7. And so in each of those chapters, we would choose one pericope, and then we would do a chiasm in that section just to kind of try to help you understand how the chiasms work and the different structures.
What's the chiasm?
Okay, the chiasm is symmetry. So it's the way the writers would sometimes write in order to help the Hebrew people to dig for the treasure. So you would often have the symmetry where the outside would match, and then as you would come in, there would be matching or parallel or exact opposites, or whichever way to kind of line something up. And then the center point is usually your most important point that the writer is trying to convey. And as we've been going through Matthew, if you remember, a lot of times this center point is about the identity of Jesus. Who is this Jesus? And so as we were going through the Moses section, if you remember, we would choose one chiasm, though there were more in each chapter, but we would just choose one. But then we did a section where we folded in the narrative section and showed that there was a massive chiasm among the narrative section itself. And then we did the same with the teaching. Now we're about to do that with Moses. We've studied Matthew, Joshua. That's what I mean. It's all in Matthew. Sorry. Yes. We're coming out of 2 surgeries. So we're probably going to have some slips of words today. Matthew 8 and 9, as we do that Jesus is greater than Joshua, the Jewish hero. We've done chapter 8, and then we did chapter 9. And now today we're going to go in and we're going to go ahead and look at the narrative sections of 8 and 9. And we're going to show that there was a massive chiasm that folds in upon itself in chapters 8 and 9, which leaves you with a center point about the identity of Jesus. It's fascinating awesome writing where only we believe God could write like this, because it is so fascinating and complex.
It also shows that every bit of it is intentional. Like we said, some scholars and theologians try to say, oh, Jesus said this word, and this is a story taken from here and taken from there. This shows that the stories were intentionally put together because they're pointing to a message. Even the choice of the stories themselves point to the central message of who is Jesus. So today we're going to be looking at Matthew 8 and 9. And on this screen right here, we'll make it bigger so you can see it. There we go. So in this writing, what we've done is just taken the headers, and they're called kephali in Greek. The headers basically are just the section breaks that are describing the action. Jesus heals a man with leprosy, faith is centurion, all the way down to the workers are few. And you may have some different titles in your Bible. And that's actually one of the benefits of having titles. As you can see, it actually helps us move toward an understanding of the 2 chapters are actually a chiasm as a whole. But there's also one problem in this section, and we think there's missing one of the headings is missing, and that's what we're going to point out in just a little bit. So let me adjust this. What's this? What's that?
I think it's a church.
I think that's yours over there. So what we do here is we will find common words at the beginning and the end, and then at key points in the middle, and try to find out where these parts line up. So as we look at it, we found in the beginning of chapter 8, Jesus is talking about, he comes down from the mountain, from the Sermon on the Mount, and he meets a man with leprosy.
Sorry.
And this actually, he sees a crowd, that the crowd is following. He's willing to do something. He's willing to make them clean. He has compassion on them, and he's willing to cleanse the people of leprosy. And this actually parallels the very last story in The Workers Are Few, where Jesus saw the crowds. He said they were like sheep without a shepherd. They were harassed and helpless, and he had compassion on them. And so in the first little story, the first pericope, Jesus says, but go show yourself to the priest. And in the last section, he tells them to send out workers. He tells them to go. All right. Let's see if we can change the screen here a little bit. And let me come off the major screen here, and I'll see if I can change it to this. There we go. All right. Okay. So this may or may not make sense to you, because the main thing is there are crowds following, and he saw the crowds. Those are the two key words that let you know there's crowds that are on the end points of this whole two chapters, 8 and 9. But in the middle, you begin to see a more distinct one. This is the one of the following of Jesus, the cost of following Jesus. And a few times in this section, he says, somebody says, I will follow you. And Jesus says, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, but follow me. And so you're like, well, let's look in these two chapters. Is there a place somewhere else where Jesus says, follow me? Indeed, there is, in the calling of Matthew. And here Jesus tells him, follow me, follow me. And so Matthew got up and followed him. And another interesting thing is Jesus says the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And what does Matthew have? Matthew has a house, a place to lay his head. So you have no place to lay his head, but in Matthew's house, there's a place to lay his head. Follow me, follow me. So that's a more clear one than even the red one, in my opinion. So what we do next is we kind of move these over to show, are they moving in a common direction? So here's how we begin spacing over, and we see a couple of pericope at the beginning. Faith the centurion, Jesus healing many, and Jesus raising the dead girl, healing the sick woman, and Jesus healing the blind and mute at the bottom there. And now we'll look, are there more parallels? Are there more common words? Indeed, there are.
So, do you want me to do one?
You're doing
okay.
that.
So if you look at the blue, let's see, what color is that? You want to do the blue?
And orange,
okay.
yeah.
So the blue, again, the faith of the centurion, I think you've already done that one, haven't you?
No,
you haven't done that one. Okay. The faith of the centurion. And then he talks about, you see the word under the roof, and then you see the word faith, let it be done. And then if you go down to the bottom blue, you'll see, again, it's about some healing that's taking place, but you see the word indoors, went indoors. Well, that would be under the roof. So again, you're noticing some parallels, some symmetry that's taking place. And then again, it's going to talk about in that little section about faith, according to your faith. And then Jesus is talking about the man, the centurion, about his great faith. And then his response to both is, let it be done to you.
And the same phrase in both places, let it be done. Yeah. So in the orange, Jesus heals many at the beginning. There's Peter's mother-in-law who has a fever, and then there's some demons that need to be cast out. People need to be healed. And so Jesus touches her hand, takes her by the hand, and touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on them. Okay, cool. He touched her hand, the fever left, and she got up. And this interestingly parallels the orange section at the bottom where Jesus raises the dead girl and heals a sick woman. The bleeding woman was healed. And then the daughter, Jairus' daughter, had died. And so what does it say about how he treated her when he came in the room? He said that people laughed at him after the crowd had been put outside. He went in, took the girl by the hand, and she got up.
So again, it's taking by the hand. He takes the woman by the hand, he takes the girl by the hand, and they get up. It's
not dramatic things, but what you're finding is that the writer, Matthew, is pointing as here's something, and here's something, here's something, and here's something. And so it's similar phrases and words let us know that this is indeed a chiasm.
And I would just want to highlight, as a Western reader, You may be thinking, okay, there's some parallel words. That's great. But remember, the Hebrew reader or listener, they are on a treasure hunt. That's the way their literary structure is designed. So they're on a hunt and they're like, oh, cool, there's these things, because they're looking for the very main point that's the treasure of the entire story. Because it's not just a story to relay facts. It's a story that's trying to draw a deeper meaning out. That's why, when he asked questions, when you look at the Gospels and you see how many questions Jesus asked, he was constantly asking questions. And sometimes he would answer a question that someone asked him by raising another question.
Mhm.
It wasn't that Jesus didn't have answers. It's that he was doing a Hebrew style where he's driving to get to the main point, but he's doing it through a strategy of question asking, but he knew where he was going to go. He knew where he wanted the listener to arrive, but he took them on this little hunt just because it's the way the Hebrew listeners were used to literary structures.
And so now we come to the interesting part. So you have the red sections at the beginning and end. You have the blue sections, the orange sections, and the green sections. And then there's 4 sections still in the black. Jesus calms the storm. Jesus restores 2 demon-possessed men. Jesus forgives and heals a paralyzed man. And then dangling at the bottom is Jesus' question about fasting. You may wonder initially, how in the world do these relate? Well, let's look a little further and we'll see what we come up with. First, we move these across so it kind of looks like an arrow pointing to the center part. And now it's kind of like a leap. You got to kind of just guess, what do we think says the most about the identity, the character, the nature of Jesus? And we think it's the story Jesus forgives and heals a paralyzed man. And so we're going to set that apart in this picture here. You can see.
And again, it's a guess. So we're going to do the guess. So we're going to take the leap.
Maybe we're wrong.
Then we're going to see if we can then see symmetry that comes outside of that center point to see if the leap was a pretty good one, but you don't know it until you get started.
And so you got to guess and say, hey, I think this is going to be the center point. So the center story is the marvelous story about the friends who are carrying the paralyzed man, and they rip the roof off and they lower him down. And Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. Oh, who can do that? And so the leaders say, who is this guy? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins except God? This fellow's blaspheming. And Jesus says, you're entertaining thoughts in your heart. The last session we did they were saying these things in their heart, but Jesus knew it. And he wanted them to know something. So the word knowing is pointing there toward to the center part there. But Jesus has the power to forgive sins. And how do we know that? Because he also has the power to heal. And so he heals the paralyzed man, which means he also can forgive sins, which means he's God, which means God is the only one who has the power to forgive sins and heal. And so we think that is the center point of this two-chapter pericope, two-chapter chiasm of Joshua. Now, before we get any further, Joshua, again, was the conqueror. He was the one who drove out the Canaanites. He's the one who used the sword to kill the enemies, to slay the enemies, to overcome. And Jesus is also driving out. But here we're seeing, who is he driving out? What is he driving out? He's not driving out people. He's driving out demons. What else is he driving out? He's driving out sickness. He's driving out disease. He's driving out death. He's
driving out sin, which is where the slavery is coming from for people.
So in the center story there, the center part of this chiasm, he's driving out sin and sickness. And so this is becoming because he's willing, because they're a sheep without a shepherd, he then heals their sin and he heals their sickness. So now we're stuck with 2 things. We have 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom: calming the storm, restoring demon-possessed men, and questions about fasting. At this point, we have to look, are the kephali correct? Are the headings correct? And we've looked back at the second one there, and we thought, what if the fasting one was not just one story? What if it was actually 2 stories? And so I'm going to read this just for a second here and ask you, do you think this is 1 story or 2? It's from verse 14, chapter 9, down to verse 17. Verse 14 says, then John's disciples came and asked him, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Jesus answered, How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. That sounds like the ending of a story to me, because the next section starts a new thought, and I don't see the direct connection between these two stories. But here's the next part, verse 16. After the fasting part and the bridegroom being taken from them, verse 16 says, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst and the wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins and both are preserved." Now, maybe there's a connection with those two between 14, 15 and the fasting and the John's disciples and the bridegroom. Maybe there's a direct connection with that and the unshrunk cloth, but I kind of see should be another heading there. And so what we've done is, let's move here. There we go. We think there's another heading that needs to go right there. Something about unshrunk cloth and the new wineskins.
And I just want to say, by us saying another heading, this doesn't mean we're adding anything to the scriptures.
Right,
This doesn't.
exactly.
This has nothing to do with the inspiration or the authority of scripture. This is when the people that were helping us to understand the scriptures, they added the headings to try to break things up into paragraph form. Much of it is because of the way that we think in the West. And so they're doing this to try to help us to see the clear paragraph breaks. And so for us to say, oh, we think there's actually another heading, that doesn't mean we're saying that the Bible's got a mistake or anything like that with the inspiration. We're just
headings
saying
and chapters and verses.
these are things added, I think,
Added.
like in the 15th century or something like that. So
2nd century, 13th century, 15th century. Now we have paragraphs. If you look in the Greek manuscript, there's no paragraphs.
there's no punctuation even because they were saving room. So
Yeah.
I just want to make that little point. So we've got that we think now we're looking at to where you see red, blue, orange. And if you look from the bottom, you see red, blue, orange. It's exactly how a chiasm works.
Mhm.
And then after the orange, you have this green section, and then you have some black. Well, it's interesting because we've explained with chiasms, they don't have to always be ABC, CBA. They don't have to be ABCD, CBA, that there can be different ways of structure within them as long as there's symmetry involved. And so as you begin to look at this, you see the red, blue, orange, then you see red, blue, orange. Now we're about to see a different kind of symmetry that's about to be broken out as we look at the green, black, and we'll be adding another color.
It's DEF, DEF is what's going to come out.
What you're going to see.
Yeah. All right. So
Here it begins.
Jesus restores 2 demon-possessed men at the top in the red, where he casts out demons. He has power over the demonic powers, and the pigs receive the demons and they run down the hill and they die in the water. And the 2 men are saved, right? That's the idea, is these 2 men are unable to be approached. They're violent. Nobody will pass that way. And the demons shout, "Are you going to come and torture us, Son of God?" So there's these 2 men have been really demonized and bothered by these demons. And so Jesus says, go. He casts the demons out. They go to the pigs and the pigs die. Now you get to the bottom section.
You compare this bottom section to it, and Jesus is going to teach on 2 things: cloth, and he's going to teach about wineskins. And remember at the red above, he was talking about 2 demon-possessed men. And then he's going to then talk about the 2 illustrations that no one puts wine, old wine into new skin. And he does this about the material as well. And then he's going to say both are preserved and kept safe if you put the right kind of wine in the right kind of skin and the right kind of cloth, if you do the right way of doing those things, the new patch. And then it says that both are preserved, that they're not ripped or torn, or the wineskin does not burst. It does not run and ruin. So when you compare it to the one above, you have 2 demon-possessed men. The one below, you have the cloth and you have the wineskin.
That are preserved and saved.
That are preserved.
Yeah.
So, and then what happens to the demon-possessed men? They are preserved and saved, just as the wineskin and cloth are preserved, because the demons are pushed out and they're going into the pigs, and they are the ones that die, but it's the men are saved.
And the word cast out in the Greek is balo. Ekbalo, to cast. Ek means out. Balo means to throw, like a ball. So ekbalo means to throw out or cast out. And that's the word that's used to describe what Jesus does to the demons. He cast them out, ekbalo. But the word at the bottom, not used anywhere else in the passage really, is balo again. Not ekbalo, but put. You put the wine in the new skin. You put the cloth on the patch on the cloth. And so you ekbalo, cast out, or balo, put to save. So it's very interesting that we found the matching part at the bottom. So we're like, that's great. And also, what do the pigs do after the demons go into them? They rush down the hill, they run down the hill, and they die. And what does Jesus say about the wine? If it's not properly cared for, it will run out and be ruined. So there you go. You have to look at this a little bit of the Greek here, but also the concept, things that run away, things that are saved, things that are cast out or put on. And so here we have the red matching the red. And now we are left with this very interesting one. Jesus calms the storm, and Jesus questioned about fasting. Now, these are quite interesting parallels, because this is, if we get this one, it means we've figured out the whole puzzle here, maybe another part of the puzzle. But does this really make sense? Jesus is sleeping in the boat and the storm is coming up. This is chapter 8, verses 23 to 27. And here we have the storm comes up on the lake. Waves are sweeping over the boat. Jesus is sleeping. Disciples say, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. You have little faith. Why are you so afraid? Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was calm, and the men were amazed. What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Okay, now here's the second part. When Jesus is questioned about fasting, we've already read that. John's disciples came and asked him, how can we and the Pharisees, how is it that we fast, but your disciples do not fast? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he's with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. That's a strange one. Where do we find the parallels between calming the storm and the disciples fasting? So this is what we're going to find here. If you dig around and find a little research, you'll find that Jesus was casting out evil. He was casting out demons. He was casting out actually the god Baal. And if you know, on Mount Carmel, when Elijah and the prophets of Baal were there, he said, let the storm god come up. Let your thunder and lightning come down and the fire come down. Because Baal was the god of storms. Baal was the god of thunder and fire and waves and water. And so what does Jesus do? He says, shh, be still. He rebuked it, and the wind and the waves became still. He showed in the first part that he was the god of the storm. He was the god over Baal, and he drove out Baal, making Baal be silent, making Baal be calm, making the storm and the waves calm completely. And so Jesus silenced the storm. That's the clear teaching of the first little story there about Jesus calming the storm. He was asleep, but when he got up and spoke, then Baal became quiet. The storm was silenced. The wind and the waves stopped. Now, how does this relate to the fasting question in the bottom? Actually, we have to go back to the section as a whole. You remember the name of the section? This is not the Moses section. It's not Solomon, which comes next. This is the Joshua section. And in the book of Joshua, there is a fast, but it's not a fast of food. Do you remember the kind of fasting that happened where they intentionally gave up something because of God's command? What did they give up? What did they give up? They gave up speaking. They gave up speaking. And you've heard of the Daniel fast, right? You've heard of different kinds of fasting in the Old Testament. Nazarites don't eat certain things, and the Daniel fast was just vegetables and those kind of things. But in Joshua, there's actually another fast that's listed. It's in chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. I'll read just quickly. Are you going to read this?
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you want me to read?
10 and 11. Yeah. So they're about to go into Jericho, and God gives some specific commands of how they are to enter this battleground.
Okay. Of chapter 6, right?
10, 11, yeah.
Okay. But Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. So we had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there.
That's a fast. It's a fasting of words. And so Jesus was speaking about, in the beginning, in the first section there, he knew when to be quiet. He's sleeping, and he knew when to speak. And when he spoke, the enemy became quiet. And in Joshua, when Joshua told them to be quiet, they're marching around, blowing the horn, marching, marching, marching. But then when he said, now it's time to shout, when they shouted, the enemy crumbled. The whole city of Jericho fell down, and they rushed in and became victorious. So now it makes sense. When you have Joshua, the type of fast of Joshua, it's a fasting of words, not food, but a fasting of words matches the words that were limited by Jesus and then the words that were given by Jesus in order to defeat the enemy. And so we have that. And now it lines up.
So now if you follow down with me, you start with the red: A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
G is the center part.
Is the center part. D, E, F, C, B, A.
So there you go. This is an example of an interesting chiasm based on finding another heading that matches finding. So this is not an easy one, actually. This is pretty tricky, but it's beautiful when you look at it, because the two demon-possessed men, Jesus teaches saving the cloth and the wineskin. The garment is saved and the wine is saved. And Jesus calms the storm, and Jesus knows when to speak and when to refrain from speaking.
And when you think about the yellow section, just about who Jesus is, forgiving and healing, again, it just, confirms all that we see in the Gospels. He did not come to condemn the world. The world's already condemned. He didn't come to condemn the world, but to save the world. And so he comes in order to forgive and then to drive out the things that are hurting humanity, which are anything that is based on the serpent, the demons, the demonic that is trying to hurt the image bearers who are God's sons and daughters. And Jesus comes not to condemn them, but to deliver them and to drive out the things that are pushing against them. He pushes out what pushes against humanity.
Which parallels Joshua once again, because Joshua and the Israelite army drove out the enemies at God's command, driving out the Jericho and Ai and all the different cities that were standing against God. Jesus comes as the fulfillment of the Joshua. He is Yeshua, after all, Joshua. And he's the one who's driving out the enemies, the sickness, the death, the storms, the Baal, the disease, the demons. So over and over in this narrative section of Joshua, we see Jesus surpassing the Old Testament hero.
And before you go to the next slide, I'll just say, or is it just
the conclusion?
Conclusion, yeah. I'll just say one practical thing that I want to say coming out of this is, when you think about the book of Acts, which is not what we're studying today, but you think about Jesus's very last words before he ascended. And I'm not talking about the Matthew one where he says, go into all the world, make disciples. But in Acts, he tells them to wait. And then what does he tell them? The very last phrase he says in Acts 1:8 before he ascends. And we know that's when he ascends, because then the angels come in and say, what men are you looking for? Why are you waiting here? Why are you waiting around? The last words of Jesus are ends of the earth. There's the very last words of Jesus, ends of the earth. And then they're just like, and then their disciples are like, okay, he's going to come back, but you don't need to be staring there waiting for him to come back. Ends of the earth. And so I think as we continue to look for the identity of Jesus, I think that's the phrase we need to remember, is that he forgives and he heals and he casts out demons and he casts out the demonic that's just infiltrated the entire globe, every ethnic group. And for both the Jewish people and the Gentile people, all ethnic groups, that is what Jesus wants us to do, is to move this gospel, this saving gospel of who Jesus is, to the very ends of the earth.
Excellent. So with the next slide here, let's see. Next time we meet, we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 10. And this is, again, one chapter. This is the teaching section of the Joshua branch. And in the teaching section of the Joshua branch, it is, of course, a beautiful chiasm. And you can see if you can work out the structure of it. This is where Jesus sends out the disciples. And so again, just like Joshua sent out the tribes to go out and conquer and go and spy out and go and be victorious, Jesus sends his people out with a great commission, with a great empowerment, with a great authority. And so we'll look at chapter 10. So see if you can find the literary structure there. It is a beautiful chiasm. And so join us again next week. We'll look at Matthew chapter 10 and see how Joshua, in the teaching section, how Jesus instructs his disciples to go out and make disciples of all people. So.
Yes. And I just want to give a shout out to Casey. Thank you so much for having our family in your prayers. We did survive 2 surgeries. We're still healing. We still got a huge cast on one kid, and one child's on an antibiotic because there's swelling in the gums. So we're hoping there's not an infection setting up in the bone graft. But thank you, Casey, so much for your prayers, and for any of you who have prayed for our family. It's been a really hard April, and we're glad it's finished. Yeah. So love you in Tennessee, Casey.
See you guys. God bless.
God bless.